Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on the time of day you are tuning into this lecture. I am Dr. Emily Hager Casey Camp, and today I am bringing you the first half of Chapter 6 lecture on the French and Indian War and the British colonial crisis. I have divided this into two parts, one of which is kind of focused on the French and Indian War, and the second half is focused on the subsequent colonial crisis. And when we move on here, you will see that I'm going to use the term 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War interchangeably. This is something internationally, the French and Indian War is called the 7 Years' War. Obviously, the French don't call it the French and Indian War, so it's a bit confusing. But the textbook and myself, we're going to use those two terms interchangeably. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. But this half of the lecture is going to be looking at how the American colonies fit into the British Empire's campaigns against other European powers. And we're also going to be talking about the origins of the war and how the American colonies played a role in bringing about the war. And then we are also then going to be talking about how the 7 Years' War laid the groundwork for the imperial crisis of the 1760s in British North America. So when we're talking about this, we have to talk a little bit about pre-war America. This is kind of what the vague terms of different empires claims in the North America. And you can see here the British are fairly confined to the North Atlantic seaboard, and we've been talking about the northern colonies. Here's the Mason-Dixon line, although it has not quite been surveyed the way we call it by Mason and Dixon. But this is the northern area that we are talking about. And I do want to point out here, what is present-day Maine was actually a part of Massachusetts. So even though it was settling Maine, Massachusetts was in charge of settling Maine at that point in time. And so this is the British. Now, the British also had, in 1774, claims in Canada. Now, the French portion, sometimes we talk about French Louisiana or French Canada, and the different like where they are in New Orleans. Most of the time when we're talking about French Louisiana, we are talking about what is south of the Great Lakes, and what is north, we talk French Canada, although it's not here. So we're going to be talking a lot about Quebec, Montreal, and the different forts here I think are very important on this map because they show us that the French did not have a lot of settlements. What they have, and the Spanish also, you can see here in the borderlands on the fringes of their empire, they tend to have fortifications and missions. Now, they don't have settlements. They don't have a whole lot of settlers. They are using trade and Native American agreements. Now, there's a couple of locations that I'm going to be talking about today. And one of them, before I move on here, one of them is the Ohio River Valley. Well, this here is the Ohio River. And when we talk about the Ohio River Valley, we're actually talking about any water that flows into the Ohio River. So that's all this is coming down from here, and also down what doesn't go into the Ohio River. On this side goes in the Tennessee River, but there are areas where it flows south. And we are actually right here on the border in Frostburg. We are on the border of what would go into the Ohio Valley drainage and what goes to the Chesapeake. That's what's called the Eastern Continental Divide, if any of you are familiar of seeing those signs before. Now, it's not the Continental Divide, but the Eastern Continental Divide. Now, another area on the map that we want to look at here is around New York, because this is really important because this is where the Iroquois Confederacy are located. The Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. Now, there is another part of the Iroquois Confederacy, the Tuscarora, who are going to join in later. But they're right here. And the reason why that is so important is if you look, this part of New York where they are settled is right between the British and the French claims. And so they are very much stuck in the middle, wedged between the British and the French. And this has been going on for a long time because one of the first places that they are going to settle is in the St. Lawrence River Valley in the French. And of course, we know about all the colonies that are happening in the north. So now the Iroquois Confederacy have always, as they have been always been wedged between the English and the French, have learned to maintain their power by playing the French and the British off of one another, by trading, kind of pitting them against each other. And that is how they've maintained their power. Now, they are a hugely powerful group. They have a lot of power, a lot of influence. They have huge trade networks. Actually, for many decades and decades, for 100 years, the Iroquois Confederacy was the most powerful force in North America. They are going to lay waste, excuse me, lay waste to all of the Ohio River Valley, out to the Great Lakes region, and completely dominate that militarily. Now, whenever they're playing the British and the French or others off of one another, that is going to be called Indian politics. Basically, they're like, well, if you don't give us good trading prices, we'll go and trade with the French. And to the French, they say, if you try to move into this land, we're going to go ally with the British. So they kind of play, they use these two powers, these two big empires, playing them back and forth off of one another. Now, one of the things that's going to happen with the Iroquois Confederacy here is that mainly the trade that's being done in the Ohio River Valley is controlled by the Iroquois, and they have mainly been trading with the French, but they're looking forward to trading with the British because the British are going to have some better trade prices for a couple of different reasons. They have really good trade prices because trading is just a means to an end. The Ohio Company of Virginia is going to start moving into the Ohio Valley, and they are looking to map it, to expand, and to eventually put settlers on that land. The British are a settlement empire. They're putting people on the ground to hold that territory. But the Ohio Company is going to go out and trade, try to make friends with the Native Americans, with the Ohio Indians. Now, the Ohio Indians, as I said, are kind of militarily dominated, and actually many of them, the Iroquois call them their little brothers because they say they protect them, but they also control them. And so the Ohio Company of Virginia is going into the Ohio Valley, trading with really good trading prices. And this is really going to tick off the French because this is their bread and butter coming out of the Ohio River Valley. Now, the Ohio Company of Virginia is going to receive a land grant from the king for land in the Ohio Valley. And they are going to start sending men, mappers, groups of people out into this territory, and it's really going to start to irritate the French. So what do the French do in response? They send out a military expedition. So this is very different from what the English did, because the English are going to send settlers. The French don't have any settlers to send, so they send Celeron. And if you go out into the West, I've lived in parts of Ohio and parts of West Virginia, you were going to see Celeron everything. But Celeron building a fort cost a lot of money. Leaving a military presence cost a lot of money. So what the French government does, they say, well, we are going to put these lead plates, oh, and this should say lead. Oops. Yikes. Lead plates into the ground, basically saying that this river valley here is and they call the Ohio Valley the Belle Riviere, meaning the beautiful river. And they are going to say, this belongs to us. You cannot be in here. Ohio Company, British, get out. So they're looking for places to build forts, but they don't have the means, the ability, the intelligence to and when I say intelligence, I mean like intel, not that they're not smart enough. They're smart enough to know the fact that they need to build the forts, but nobody really knows what's in the Ohio Valley. They have no idea what is going on there. So that's the French response to the Ohio Company of Virginia. Now, the Ohio Company is not going to stop. They're going to continue sending men and traders and trade goods, and this is just irritating the French. And now, of course, other colonies are also starting to expand, and the French are going to go ahead and go on a fort building spree. Everywhere you see one of these little shields with the French fleur-de-lis on it. And now, I don't know if I can blow this up big enough to show you a fleur-de-lis. Let me see if I can find one. I wanted to show you this really quickly because one of the things about these history classes that you have to take for for a requirement, one of the things is that you learn things culturally, and I always try to teach what I think is important in history. And also what is important for you to know culturally. And so this is, you have seen this signal before. It's a symbol on many things. Rock and Republic used it on their jeans. You're going to see it everywhere. But this kind of silhouette, this outline is called the fleur-de-lis.
Fleur-de-lis.
The fleur-de-lis. And this is the symbol of France. And so it's a very French meaning, kind of the symbol of the French. But I think it's very important for us that we can kind of all recognize that, and you can kind of learn about it. But the French are going to build all of these forts, and a lot of them are in the Ohio River Valley. And the British and the Virginians, especially, who have been sending out men and traders and trade goods, and there's a lot of other things that are going on between this time. A lot of British traders are going to disappear. They're going to be killed off, or they're going to be taken prisoner and going to be sent away. So there's an escalation here, but this is kind of like backcountry fighting. But the French are basically now saying, well, this is ours. We're putting forts here. And the British, in response, are going to send a man who we're going to be talking about for a couple of weeks. Actually, this unit could be the start of the George Washington unit. They're going to send George Washington on an expedition into the Ohio Valley up to south of what is modern-day Pittsburgh. There's their intention initially. They are basically saying, you know what, we're going to send George Washington to tell the French that they should leave. Now, George Washington is a very young man. He is 21 years old, and of course, he doesn't know his way around. So he actually is going with the Ohio Company's main man, and that's him here, Christopher Gist. And even though he is actually a lot older than he appears in this painting, he's actually in his 50s, and George Washington is 21. But George Washington is working for the Ohio Company and Governor Dinwiddie, and Governor Dinwiddie is the governor of Virginia. So George Washington, it's really important for us to kind of understand his background for the purposes of this lecture and for the unit as a whole. But George Washington he is a younger son of a middling sort of Virginia planter. They are not the richest in Virginia. They are definitely not in the elites. And he is the second son of that. They're definitely an elite cultural family. They're a plantation. They're planters. But George Washington is not going to inherit a lot of money. And what many second sons in British families did, because they were like, we're not going to get any land because that goes to the oldest son. And actually, George Washington's older brother had already inherited a good portion, had already inherited the land. And George Washington is kind of raised by his older brother because his parents have passed on. So George Washington is like, well, I'm not going to get this land for my brother. He's running things. How am I going to make my way in the world? So he's like, I'm going to join the military. That's the way to move up. That's how I'm going to make something of myself. That's how I'm going to get along in this world. So he volunteers to go on this military expedition, and it's a pretty big deal. They're like, hey, go up through this Ohio Valley, which is filled with Native Americans, some of who are friendly with the British, some of who are not friendly with the British. Actually, there's going to be multiple points where Native Americans and their allies, the French, are going to try to take George Washington out. They're basically going to try we'll just keep them from going back to Virginia. So one of the things that they do is when they get to Fort LeBoeuf, basically, or when they get to Pittsburgh, what is it, around modern-day Pittsburgh, basically the French say, well, we can't see you. They send them up to a further away point, Presque Isle, and they basically tell the French, like, hey, you're trespassing. This is British land. And the British he's sent with his letter from Governor Dinwiddie, and the French basically laugh at him. Here it is, two men with some of their Native American allies coming up to tell the French army to get out of the Ohio Valley. So the French laugh at them and they're like, you know what? We're not leaving. And they basically say, you have no reason to tell us that you can leave. Well, George Washington takes this information back, and Virginia is like, okay, well, now it's go time. And they start recruiting men. And George Washington is one of the people who's in charge. The Ohio Company starts building a fort, and the fort is going to be captured by the French. And then George Washington is on his way to actually reinforce the Ohio Company fort whenever the French have already taken over the Ohio Company's fort. So he's on his way to reinforce them, and he realized that the fort has fallen. So he built Fort Necessity. And this is where the first actual shots are going to be fired of the French and Indian War. And this is also at a location called Great Meadows. If you ever get to go to Fort Necessity, they have a fantastic visitor center there. I'd really recommend going. And although George Washington, this is going to be his first real military command, he actually is only going to be in command because the guy, Colonel Fry, falls off of his horse and is killed. And so George Washington becomes the de facto leader, and he is going to lose. And on July 3rd and July 4th, the French are going to take Fort Necessity. And Washington eventually has to resign his military commission here because he's being blamed for Fort Necessity. And there's a whole lot of backstory that goes on here. There's an incident at Jumonville where the British had attacked a small French force, and a guy named Jumonville, was killed, and Washington ends up taking responsibility for his assassination. And he doesn't know he's signing this document that's written in French, and George Washington interpreter is actually a Dutch guy, so he is translating it from French into Dutch and then from Dutch into English. And George Washington does not really understand that he is being blamed for the death of this assassination of this elite French military leader named Jumonville. And so Washington is going to go back to Virginia, back to Governor Dinwiddie in Williamsburg, in a complete disgrace. And he is going to write a journal out, and of course he recognizes that he was against a much stronger army, but this is a hard thing for him, and he's going to eventually end up rejoining the military whenever General Braddock comes. But in the meantime, this world war has broken out. So why is it a world war? You're like, okay, some armies were scrambling around in the Ohio Valley. How has it become a world war? Well, because it's the British and the French. They're fighting one another. And we also have the French and the Spanish are allied against the British. The Spanish are going to get involved on the side of the French. And so now the Spanish are involved. And because the Spanish and the French and the British empires and the Dutch empires also are all over the place, and because empires are also about European politics, everyone's going to get involved. So we're going to see fighting happening in North America, all over North America. We're going to see a huge amount of fighting taking place in Europe, and we're also going to see fighting taking place in India. Now, also, it's going to affect trade and colonization in Africa and in South America. So this is going to be kind of everywhere, and it's going to spread. So it's happening on 3 continents. It's pretty massive deal. Now, while there's all this fighting going on all around the world, which is a really great military, if you're looking for something to kind of explain how this all fits together for you, there's a really great book called Crucible of War by a guy named Fred Anderson, and it really walks you through the entire thing. There's also a really great book by Fred Anderson also that just focuses on the United States portion. It's called The War That Made America, and it's actually all about the French and Indian War from an American perspective, and it's actually a PBS series as well, so you can see that. You can check that out on Canopy if you wanted to. But while all this is going on all around the world, this is a United States history class, but while that's all going on, back even as Virginians and Frenchmen and Indians are fighting and dying in the Ohio Valley, some British leaders are like, maybe we could keep this from turning into an international war. And their timing is going to be it's not going to work out. In June and July of 1954, delegates were sent from colonies to meet with Indians from the Iroquois Confederacy. And they're going to meet in Albany, New York. And their purpose here is to strengthen the British alliances with the very powerful and some of the neutral Native American tribes, basically trying to keep them from supporting the French. Now, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Hutchison are going to take this opportunity to create what they call the Albany Plan of Union at the Albany Congress. Now, this Albany Plan of Union proposes a unified colonial government. Basically, that all of the colonies would unite, all of the North, all in the South, they would unite and have one unified colonial government to have sole authority over questions of war, peace, trade with the Indians. Now, one of the things here is that kind of keeps the Albany Congress from happening is the fact that the Virginians are kind of like, look, we have been talking about the Ohio Valley situation and the French threat for like 10 years, and no one has been listening to us, and now we're out here fighting, and now you guys want to like keep talking about it some more. Like, time has passed. We've got to build some forts. And the Virginians don't go to the Albany Congress. And it would be very, very hard to unify the colonies without the Virginians. And you can see here, I mean, this is Virginia. It's right in the middle. How are you going to unify without them? So the French and the Frenchmen are like pressing in and the Virginians are fighting them off. They're like, yeah, we don't go to the Albany Congress. But the Albany Congress delegates are kind of like, all right, we kind of like the idea of this unified colonial government. And they agree that they are going to go back home to each of their colonies and present the Albany plans to their respective assemblies. And they're like, yeah, this kind of makes some good sense. Like, this sounds like a good idea. We could have, like, all of us would be, instead of having like 6 or 7 different colonies doing their own thing, we could be unified, but not a single colony approved the plan. And the British did not want them to be unified either. It's harder to control them if they're unified. So the British are like, nope. Nope. And the Native Americans, of course, are playing the different colonies off of each other as well. And they don't like this plan either. So instead of supporting the Albany plan, what the British governments do is appoint 2 superintendents of Indian affairs, one for the North, another for the South. And each one of these is going to have exclusive powers to negotiate treaties and trade and land sales with Native Americans. So they are at least saying, well, we do have to have some kind of unified plan to work with the Native Americans. And this is their solution, is to appoint these superintendents. Now, so the war is going to, Washington's frontier skirmish, as I said, is going to turn into this international war. The British and the French forces are going to declare war on May 8th and May 9th of 1756. And the French and Indian forces are going to be ambush the British troops that are marching towards Fort Duquesne, killing nearly 1,000 British soldiers. And for the next 2 years, the British are going to be stumbling very badly. The first 2 years of the war are very bad for the British. And then in 1756, this new man is going to come on the scene, and his name is William Pitt, and he is going to become England's prime minister, and he is going to finally turn the war around. He basically is willing to commit massive resources to fight France and Spain worldwide, and also in America. Basically, the British are kind of, at this point, haven't been really dedicated to the American War, and William Pitt also is going to say, hey, you know, American colonists, we are partners in an empire. And the colonists really like that idea because they are very proud of being a part of the great British Empire. So he is going to go ahead and try to bring them into the British Army and into the British military life. And this is going to be a bit of a problem. The British Army is brutal. There are massive whippings of if you don't obey, and it's very, very strict. It's very, very harsh. I mean, this is the time whenever the British Navy, if you disobey orders, ties you up to a rope and scrapes your body along the undersides of the ships where the barnacles just completely tear your flesh. British soldiers are not treated well by the British. It is a harsh lifestyle where it's very much class oriented. Now, the war is going to bring lots of British nobles, officers, and soldiers to America. And this is the first time that the British from England and the British colonists are going to have met in generations in some cases. And there's a lot of culture shock. In America, if you join the local militia, you join up with all of your friends and you're kind of like, yeah, so-and-so, he's a good George, he's a good leader of the community. He'll be our officer. And George is the officer. You don't court-martial your brother-in-law. You don't flog your neighbor publicly. So even though there is a bit of a hierarchy and the people who tend to be in charge are more wealthy, it's nothing like the class differentiation that's going on in England at this time. Now, so the British are two different groups that are trying now to fight a war together, and it can be very brutal. And I bring this up because this is going to start to be a problem for the British as time goes on. So I'm not going to run us down through every single battle of the war. The British are going to seize Nova Scotia. The Battle of the Wilderness in 1755 is going to leave the backwoods of the British territory completely undefended. And it's not going to be until 1757 that the commander-in-chief of the French forces is going to take Fort William Henry, and then the French are going to take Fort Ticonderoga. So the French are dominating the British in this warfare. It is a complete, like, if you were going to say, you'd be like, yeah, the French are kicking butt and taking names. Now, the British finally, through a lot of what I said, they're like making the colonies their partners, they're committing resources to winning back. And this is a really big deal because for the British, this is their main holdout in North America. And in all the Americas, they don't have anything in South America. This is it. This is it. And if they lose this war, they will be completely wiped out of any type of Western Hemisphere colonial empire. And it will just be completely dominated by the French and the Spanish. And that is absolutely not what the British want. Because once they lose control of all of that trade, that means that the French and Spanish are going to become completely dominant in Europe. And the French are going to be at their mercy. So that's when the British realized, like, we've got to make the colonists our partners and we've got to commit more resources to winning North America. They are going to see Louisbourg, they're going to open up Canada, and they're going to continue to win. Now, the Native Americans on the ground are going to kind of see this, and many Native American tribes are going to make peace in 1758 with the British. So now the French are kind of fighting without their Indian allies. The British are finally going to recapture what had been where the Ohio Company fort had been in Pittsburgh. The French had taken and built Fort Duquesne, and now the British are taking Pittsburgh back, and they're going to name it Pittsburgh after their Prime Minister, William Pitt, who was the man who really turned the war around for the British. Now, the British are going to take Fort Ticonderoga, and this is going to, again, lead them on that very slow route to victory. And for 2 more years, though, it's going to be a battle. The French are going to surrender Canada in the late 1759, and by 1760, we're going to be the functional end of the war. Okay, so what does that mean? It means we have the Treaty of Paris, otherwise called the Peace of Paris, in 1763. And there's a lot of consequences to this. This is essentially reorganizing the map of North America. Canada is going to be completely brought into the British Empire, but also completely reorganized. The British, recognizing that they can't just walk in to a huge amount of Canada, basically are saying, you know what, French, you can keep your structures in place, keep everybody on the ground, you can keep doing what you're doing, do what you want, you're now trading with us. But for a lot of people, their lives don't really change. The British are kind of happy to let them keep living the lives they were. So in that way, it's not terrible. However, the big thing is, and this has been a big turning point, had been a big part of the war, is that the French are Catholic and the British are not. And this had been kind of painted as a religious war, and that that the British wanted to rout out the terrible French Catholics and the Spanish Catholics, and and vice versa. The Catholics are like, wanting to get rid of the Protestants. So there's a lot of religion here. And the British come in and they're basically like, all right, it's not going to be anywhere near possible for us to force them to become Protestant. So they actually allow them to keep their Catholic churches and faith in place. So one of the things that's also going to happen at the Treaty of Paris is that Britain is broke. They have just dedicated a lot of money, manpower, resources to fighting this war in America, and they're going to start demanding the colonies pay that back. And there's a massive movement that's going to take place. If people are going to be moving in and out, and England is going to start to be like, why do we even have to have this war in the first place? And they start to blame it on the colonists. Like, we fought this war to protect you. We fought this war so you guys would be protected from the French. You can keep your trade. And why is this thing? Communist? I don't think so. The colonists. They basically want the colonists to pay for the war, and the colonists are saying, no, thank you. We do not really want to do that. So the British are getting a lot. So the colonists are saying, you are just got all of the French possessions east of the Mississippi, except for the port of New Orleans, which is why that's so bold here. They've retained their port at the city of New Orleans, uh, and they're going to gain control of Canada, all of the French territory in the Mississippi River. That's in this on this side, and on this side it's going to Spain. So the British have gotten a lot. So I should say also, should point out that France is more concerned in this point about retaining the islands of Martinique, Guadeloupe, and St. Lucia, because that's where the sugar is and that's where the money is. The money is not coming out from furs so much out of the Western Hemisphere. The money is coming out of the sugar plantations in the Caribbean Sea. And if you remember, really large portion, of African slaves are going to be forcibly brought over to the Caribbean to work in the sugar plantations. But one of the British are kind of irritated. They're basically like, well, the colonists were smuggling and illegally trading with the French, and that made the war last longer. And the colonists were like, hey, we showed up to work, but the military leaders were so arrogant and awful and wouldn't let us really fight. They made us do grunt work, so we weren't allowed to fight for our homes. And the military strategy where it was like, we have to pay for everything, it was a huge cost, but it's basically winning at a huge financial cost. Now, another thing that's going to happen right on the heels of that is that Pontiac, a Ottawa chief, is going to rebel. Now, it's not just him, but he's one of the leaders of the rebellion. Some people say that we shouldn't call it Pontiac's rebellion because he was just like one aspect of it. But he basically is dissatisfied with General Amherst, who is a British military commander who's been put in charge of the Native Americans. He's basically like, hey, you guys have won the war, but now you're treating us like crap. Like, this is terrible. You're not feeding us. You're not allowing us to go and hunt. We don't like this. The British do not think that the Indians will resist now that the French are gone. The British soldiers treat them badly, and they do not at all conceal their contempt for the Native Americans. And the Indians complain that they were treated like slaves and dogs. Amherst stops gifting practices, puts up trade restrictions, especially regarding gunpowder and firearms, which he says is for security, but now the Native Americans are not able to feed themselves. At this same time that Pontiac is rebelling, a Delaware prophet and a medicine man, a religious leader, his name is Neolin, he is going to lead a major philosophical movement among Native Americans. And it's not just the Delaware. It is all different Native American groups in the eastern half of the United States. It is going to unite these groups together, which actually makes the British a little nervous. He basically is going to say, like, we need to be self-reliant. We cannot be relying on the British for gunpowder, powder, for trade, for anything. We need to be self-reliant. He also says we need moral improvement. We cannot be drinking alcohol. This is bad. And he wants he wants the Native Americans to disconnect from Europe and kick the British out and revive traditional practices. Now, this is a really tall order for many, many reasons. Number one, they are a part of the European trade community, whether they want to be or not. And they have been, by the time we're here at the point of 1763 into 1760s, they have been trading with the British pretty heavily for 100 years, and that's a long time to try to go back to the way things were. The other problem is their population has been absolutely, I can't even use the term decimated, because decimated means you lose 10%. Some historians say, well, they might have lost 90% of their population. 80 to 90% of the population is gone. And when you lose that much manpower, you lose a lot of knowledge, you lose a lot of skills. All of a sudden, all the people that live in your neighborhood or within your kinship group, within 100 miles of you, there's no one who makes pottery. There's no one that makes arrowheads anymore. There's no one who is a fletcher to make arrows. So it's very hard because you've lost so many members of your community. And when you think about it, like, how do you survive whenever a piece of the puzzles start falling away? How can you maintain any integrity of your community because you're losing so much? So, but this is what they're starting to rebel against. And so Pontiac's rebellion is going to break out. And where you can see, here's a battle fort, for a British fort. A battle is kind of marked, that the battles that are away from the forts are marked with these little explosions, I suppose they're supposed to be. And then the reds are the forts that are attacked by Native Americans. So in May of 1763, Pontiac and his followers, or his allies, however you want to say it, are going to attack British forts. And they're going to kill more than 400 soldiers, and 2,000 colonists are either going to be killed or taken captive. Now, the worst number of violent aggressions by Americans is going to occur in late 1763. About 50 Pennsylvania vigilantes known as the Paxton Boys are going to descend on a village that is a peaceful village. They are actually been converted to Christianity. They are Conestoga Indians, and they are going to fall upon this Indian and absolutely murder and massacre them, 20 of their tribe. It's just a horrible tragedy. It's very bad. But because of all this bloodshed that's going on in the fort, the British are like, man, things are spiraling out of control. And what they do is the king makes a proclamation and basically says, you know what? There's too much trouble going on between the Native Americans. There's too much trouble going on between the British and the French up here in the boundary lines. It'll be just so much better if we just say, okay, the Indians are going to live over here and the British are going to live, our colonists are going to live over here on this side of the proclamation line, essentially east of the Appalachian Mountains. And this is going to be very upsetting to many Americans because many of them are already working and living in this area. And many of them had basically said, this is what we fought the war for, because we wanted to come to this land out here. And they had already had huge lands that have been speculated in the West. And I should say that they're out here doing this because the crown has asked them to. And now the crown is like, haha, just kidding. You can't have any of that stuff. And all that stuff we were asking you to do, we're not going to pay you for it. And so they're feeling very upset. So the British are upset. The British colonists are upset that they're losing land, that they're losing money, that the British don't respect them. And this bloodshed that's happening on the frontier is leaving them very fearful and unsettling about their future. And they're also getting very wary of the British, who is claiming that they're a protective mother country. And so, but from the British perspective, from the crown, from London's perspective, they're like, man, things are really getting bad. And they're looking at things are spiraling out of control. And during the war, as I said before, the colonists and the British have realized how very different they were. The British looked down upon the colonists as being unwashed and uneducated. They weren't proper Englishmen. And they basically were like, yeah, you're a second class. And Americans saw the British as snobby, tyrannical, overbearing, disrespectful about colonial culture. And stepping all over what they can see as their rights. Now, the revolution is not inevitable, but we are moving towards revolution. That there's many points from here on out that we could say the revolution is going to be stopped, things are going to go back to normal. But it is one of the things about the French and Indian War is that the differences between the British who were living in mainland England and the colonists who are living in North America are very much highlighted. And now that the war is over, the British are trying to hold on to this massive amount of land, and they were never powerful enough to actually control the 13 colonies. So now they're going to resort to using the military to try to manage all this land. It's also really important to remember that there is no bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is the military, and that the colonists are very displeased because now they feel like they're living in an occupied state. Next time we will pick back up with the continental crisis. It's going to kind of break out here with the colonial crisis. And if you have any questions, comments, leave them down below. I would love to hear from you. I hope you all are staying safe and happy and healthy.